Burke, FitzGerald, Roche, Barry, Doyle, Lynch, Walsh, Joyce. These names sound Irish now. They feel familiar. They belong to streets, school rolls, sports teams, records, literature, politics, local memory. Many of them began somewhere else. They came by conquest, by sea, through settlement and trade. Some came through exile, and some came through refuge. But something happened to all of them. They stayed, they changed, they were spoken by Irish mouths, written by Irish scribes, and pulled through Irish grammar, Irish places. They got married, they worked, they fought, they prayed, they emigrated and returned. And generation after generation, some of those names became so woven into Irish life that they're very much part of Ireland. And that's what this episode is about, the names that Ireland absorbed. Irish surnames are not only a story of Gaelic survival, they're a story of arrival. And in this episode, we're going to look at Norman names first. The Fitzes, the FitzGeralds, the Fitzmaurices, the De Poers, the Roches, the Barras, the Barrys. Names that arrived through conquest and settlement, but are very much part of Irish life. The phrase more Irish than the Irish themselves comes to mind. It was the newcomers in this case that became Irish too. And we're going to look at the map of the names and where they are. Sometimes surnames come from places, sometimes places come from surnames. A family can carry a place in its name and a place can carry a family in its name. Sometimes the land gives the name to the family. Either way, names and maps are linked. We're also going to look at Norse and Viking traces. Doyle, MacAuliffe, MacManus, Cotter. Names that remind us that Ireland's coastline was never just an island, it was a doorway. Raiders, traders, town builders, languages. And we'll mention Lynch as well. Lynch is a very interesting one. It gives us something that a spelling can hide, a surname that can be several rivers under the same bridge. We'll look at Walsh and Joyce, names that move towards Britain, Wales and the Irish Sea. And we're also going to touch on the Huguenot names, names that remind us that not every arrival comes with a sword, but some come with exile. Briefly beyond the surnames, we look at forms of address. What we say in English, Mr., Sir, Madam. We'll talk about an túsal, a gwine úsal, a van úsal. And those words, translation, class, language, grammar, will bring us eventually to Scotland. Right on to Ireland's edge. Mac, MacDonald, MacLeod, Mackenzie, MacGregor, MacDougall. If you listen to that name Mac, which we mentioned in the first episode, you'll know the link straight away with Scotland and Alban, because at the other side of the sea, there's a wider Gaelic world, a world of clan, kinship, migration, language, colonisation and memory. But before we could talk about the names that came to Ireland, we had to look at the older Irish naming system already here. O'Brien, O'Brien, McCarthy, McCoyrig, Sullivan, O'Sullivan, and all of that is in episode 1. Please do look back at it. In that episode, we looked at words that carry descent, sonship, daughterhood, marriage, clan, kinship, and memory. And we looked at how that system was pushed through English law, English spelling, English schools and administration, and how colonialism tried to remove the meaning of Irish names themselves. The Irish naming system was fogged by Anglicisation, but not erased. So do listen back to part 1. That episode was about survival. This episode is about arrival. The names that came to Ireland, the names Ireland made its own, and the names that point us across the sea. Accordia. You're listening to Undercover Irish. This is the podcast where we uncover Ireland's hidden curriculum. Wherever you are in the world, whether you're at home or part of the great diaspora abroad, sit back, relax. Accordia, Eraigling, na Céile. So, cordial, my friends, let's begin with the names that arrived with conquest. The Norman names: FitzGerald, Fitzmaurice, de Burke, de Puer, de Roche, de Barra, de Courcy, and de Lacy, for example. These names began outside Ireland, but they do not stay outside Ireland's story. But the first thing to say is that the Normans were not simply one thing. They were not just French, they were not just English, and they weren't just invaders and not just settlers. By the time they came into Ireland in the late 12th century, they were already very layered. Norse in origin, French speaking in culture, tied to England and Wales by conquest, marriage, land and power, and then arriving into Ireland through war, ambition, alliance and invitation. So even before they reach Ireland, the Normans are already a warning against simple identity. They're layered. And when their names come into Ireland, those names carry the layers and the layered world with them. Take FitzGerald, for example. To Irish ears now, FitzGerald sounds completely Irish. It belongs to Irish history. It belongs to Irish politics. It belongs to literature, rebellion, land, power, and memory. But the Fitz at the beginning is not Gaelic. It comes from Norman French, from Fils, F-I-L-S, son. So FitzGerald means son of Gerald. Fitzmaurice means son of Maurice, and Fitzhenry means son of Henry. Fitzstephen means son of Stephen, and so forth. Now that should sound familiar to people who've listened to part one of this particular project, because in the last episode we spent time talking about Mac or Mac, MacAuliffe, MacDonald, MacGullivreada, Mac meaning son. And here we have another word meaning son, not Gaelic this time, Norman French, Fitz. And that's useful because it reminds us that different languages can answer the same human question in different ways. Who are you? I'm son of Gerald, I'm son of Maurice, I'm son of Coirig, I'm son of Doyle. Fitz and Mac are not the same language. They're not originally the same tradition, but they are doing similar kind of work. They're naming a person through descent, through fatherhood, through a remembered origin. And then there are the de names. De Burke, Burke, from de Burg. De Puer, power. De Roche, Roach. De Barra, Barry. De Courcy is the same sound. De Lawsa, de Lacy. That little de, de means from or of. So if Fitz points us towards descent, de points us towards a place, a family connected to a place, a person named through origin. And again, we are going back to one of the big themes of the last podcast, names and places speaking to each other. A surname can be a map folded into a family name. It can tell you where a family came from, or where a family thought they came from, or what place became attached to their identity. Once these names come into Ireland, they begin to change and evolve. They're spoken by new mouths, they're written by new scribes, they get pushed through Irish sounds and sometimes attached to Irish places, and they're pulled into Irish politics. They married into Irish families, they got caught up in Irish wars. Over generations, many of these names became part of Ireland itself. We were talking about de Burke, Burks. De Burke would be associated with Connacht, the FitzGeralds, MacGaralds in Kildare, Desmond and elsewhere, the Barrys in Munster, Muin, the Powers in the southeast, the Roaches in Munster, the Courcys in Ulster, Ulla. Names that arrived through conquest, yes, absolutely. But history doesn't just stop at that arrival. Sometimes invaders settle and sometimes settlers marry. The family learns the language and the children grow up local. That might be simplified, but over the courses of generations, And centuries we're all familiar with the Normans, for example, becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves, or so the saying went. So a name that once sounded foreign becomes familiar. FitzGerald becomes MacGerald. And after enough generations, people no longer hear the arrival at all. They just hear an Irish surname. Burke, Power, Roche, Barry, FitzGerald. And this is where that famous phrase, I reiterate it again, the more Irish than the Irish themselves, makes a lot of sense. It's often said casually and sometimes as a slogan, but underneath it is a real historical fact, but also an anxiety. The English administration in Ireland was not only worried that Irish people would remain Irish, it was worried that the newcomers, the colonisers, the conquistadors, if you like, would become Irish too. That they would speak Irish, that they would dress Irish, that they would marry Irish people and use Irish law. They were afraid that they would take on Irish customs and become embedded into Irish kinship and politics. Now, this anxiety helps to explain the Statutes of Kilkenny, which we mentioned in part 1. Those laws were aimed at the English in Ireland who were becoming too Gaelic for the liking of the colonial authority, and names were very central to that. Because, as I've said before, names were not neutral. A name could show you where you belonged. A name could show you what world you were entering. A name could show you the clean line between English and Irish was breaking down. So the Norman names are not just a list of surnames, they're evidence of a process, conquest, settlement, Gaelicization, absorption, a foreign name becoming local, an outsider becoming part of the country's memory. That does not make conquest harmless, and it does not erase the violence, of course. It does not turn invasion into romance, but it does show how complicated Irish history becomes once people stay. A name like Burke can carry power and settlement, but it also carries generations subsequently of Irish life. A name like FitzGerald can carry conquest and colonial privilege, but it also carries rebellion, poetry, politics and belonging. Just think of Lord Edward FitzGerald, for example. A name can arrive as one thing and become another thing, and that's central to the idea of this episode, because Irishness is not about purity. Irishness is layering as well. The names that came ashore did not remain frozen the moment they arrived. They were changed by Ireland, and Ireland was changed by them. And if Norman names bring us conquest, settlement and the map, the Norse names bring us back to the sea. So we're talking now about the Vikings, because Ireland's coastline, as we mentioned on the podcast, Ireland and the sea, it was never just the edge of an island, it was a doorway. Long before surnames became fixed in the modern sense, Ireland was already being changed by people who came by sea. Vikings, Norse settlers, raiders and traders, the town builders, people who arrived first as outsiders but who did not remain simply outside the story. They left their mark on Ireland's towns: Dublin, Ballyauchlia, Wexford, Lough Garman, Waterford, Portlauriga, Limnach, Limerick, and my own Cork, Kirkig. They left their marks on trade, on political power, on marriage, on language, and in some cases, on names. Now, this is where we need to be careful, because surname history can become very neat online and sometimes too neat. You know, you see phrases like, this is a Viking surname, or that name proves Viking ancestry, but sometimes it doesn't work out as cleanly as that. A Norse trace in an Irish surname does not always mean a family stayed Norse. It means that a Norse personal name or a Gaelic word for a foreigner entered Irish naming culture. The name came in, the Irish took a hold of it, they turned it and they made it part of their own system. Take Doyle, for example. Doyle is one of those surnames that sounds completely Irish now. But underneath Doyle is O'Dubhghaul, O'Dubhghaul, Dubhghall, and it's usually understood as a dark foreigner. Dubh meaning dark, Gaul meaning foreigner, stranger, outsider. That word Gaul is important. Think about Dún na Gaul, Donegal. You see it in Irish tradition. And in the context of early medieval Ireland, names like Dubhghaul, which becomes Doyle, and Fionnghaul, blonde foreigner, are linked with different groups of Norse or Scandinavian arrivals. So Doyle is not simply a Viking name in a straight line. It is an Irish surname, O'Dubhghaul, descendant of Dubhghaul, a Gaelic name formed around a word that remembers a certain foreignness. That's much more interesting than just saying Doyle means Viking, I think at least. Because the Irish language is not passively receiving the outsider here, it's naming the outsider and classifying the outsider, remembering him and absorbing him, and eventually the name does become anglicised to what we know today as Doyle, a familiar Irish surname. So a name may carry somewhere deep inside it the memory of an arrival and then become part of a local story. And then there are names built from Norse personal names. MacAuliffe, for example, comes from MacAuliffe, and Aulive is the Gaelic form, the Irish form of Olaf. And here again, we're not just looking at a Norse name sitting untouched inside Ireland. We're looking at Olaf, a Norse name, becoming Aulive, which we regard now as a very Gaelic Irish name. A Norse personal name being spoken as Gaeilge in Irish, brought into the Irish sound, brought into the Irish grammar, and carried forward as a Gaelic surname, Mac Aulive, the son of Aulive, the son of Olive's line, if you like to anglicise it. The same thing happens when we talk about Magnus. MacManus comes from MacManus, son of the Magnus line. Again, the name enters into Irish and the surname becomes Gaelic in structure. The English later call this MacManus, of course. You may also hear names like Cotter, Oscailga connected to MacQuitter, often linked to the Norse personal name Otar, and names connected, for example, with Ivar, so Ifada OMH or Ifada OMHAR in the Gaelic form. This is Ivar, IVAR. This is another example of a Norse name becoming Gaelicized. We know it today as MacIver, in some contexts at least. And that one is useful in a minute when we turn towards Alban, Scotland. But what's important here is the pattern. Norse name comes in, the Irish landscape and the people reshape it, and English later anglicizes it. So there's several journeys that the name travels. Olaf, Aulive, MacAuliffe, MacAuliffe. So you've got 4 different stops on that journey. Magnus, Manus, MacManus, MacManus. Again, 4 different stops. Otar, Quitter, MacQuitter, Cotter. 4 different stops. And Dubhghaul, O'Dubhghaul, Doyle. So the names themselves are journeys. They move by sea, they move by language, they move through power, settlement, marriage, and memory. And they remind us that the coastline was never just a boundary, it was a contact zone, a place where people arrived, where conflict happened, yes, where trade happened, where towns begin to grow, the cities that we see today in Ireland, and where languages met, where the stranger could become the neighbour, and where the neighbour's name could eventually sound as Irish as anybody else's. As I said earlier, that does not mean that violence disappears from history. Viking raids were real. The Norman conquest was a real thing. and the taking of the land and the wealth was a real thing. But for the purpose of the names episode, and again, if people stay long enough, some sections of history become layered. Because the raider in subsequent generations becomes the settler, the outsider in subsequent generations becomes a local, and a foreign name becomes Gaelic or Gaelicized. And subsequently, that Gaelic name, as we saw in the last episode 1 of this, becomes anglicized through later colonization. So by the time it reaches us, Doyle, MacAuliffe, Cotter, MacManus, or any other familiar surname, we're not just hearing one simple origin, we're hearing centuries of contact. And this is one of the big lessons I hope people take from this episode, that a name can arrive by sea and can still be regarded as Irish in later generations, not because the past was pure, because it wasn't, but because Ireland was always being made and remade by contact, by people coming in, and yes, by our people going abroad, by names changing mouths, by languages meeting, and by strangers becoming part of the story. I mentioned in the intro, Corja, one of the names that I wanted to mention in this podcast, Lynch. So Lynch, Lynch, in the anglicised version of it, would be regarded as a famous Irish name. It is an example that we have to be careful about looking at the history of these things, though, because Lynch is one of those names that people want a simple answer for. What does Lynch mean? Where does Lynch come from? Is it Irish? Is it Norman? Is it connected to boats? Is it connected to the Norse world? Is it connected to Lachlan or Lochlin, the word often used for Scandinavia, or the Viking word? And the honest answer is it depends. And that's not satisfying as an answer, but it's more truthful, because a surname is not always one river, as I said in the intro. Sometimes it's several rivers meeting under one spelling. Lynch can be represented Oscailga in Irish by the surname O Lynchig, O Lynchig. So that would be spelt traditionally O Fada, Loingshsigh. Now, it's a beautiful name for this because it's connected with Lynchach, a mariner or a seafarer, coming from the word lung, meaning a ship. So in that reading, Lynch carries the sea. It carries movement, it travels, I should say, by boat. It carries the idea of someone associated with ships or seafaring. And it makes it feel as if it belongs naturally beside the Norse section. We've just been talking about the Viking section. But we have to be careful, because Lynch can also have an Anglo-Norman or English root in some families. The same modern spelling can hide different origins. One Lynch family may point back to O Lynchach or O Lynchig. Others may not. One branch may have a Gaelic story, another may have a Norman story or an English story. So the history of surnames, I should say, gets very interesting indeed when you look back over these layers, because the English spelling at the end of the process can make different names look the same. Several older names can collapse into one modern form. Different languages can be squeezed into the same spelling. Different histories can end up wearing the same coat, if you like. So if you meet the name Lynch, you can't simply say, this has always been one thing. You have to ask, where is the family from? What older form appears in records? Was it written in Irish, Oscailga? Was it written in English? Was it translated? Was it altered by a clerk? Was it simplified over generations? Was another name absorbed into the spelling? And it's not just true of Lynch, it's true of many Irish surnames. The spelling alone does not tell the whole story. A modern surname is often the final visible version of a long process. Irish to English, Norman, French to Irish, Norse to Irish, Welsh even to English. You get the picture. And at every stage, something can shift a sound. Think of all the variances, the varieties of things that can happen. A sound can change, a letter can appear or disappear, a prefix can disappear, and a meaning can become hidden. A name that once sounded foreign becomes local. A name that once clearly belonged to one language can become difficult to separate from another. Think about FitzGerald and the Irish MacGerald. So this is a warning as well, not to be too confident about these things or to think about these things too simplistically. Names are not tidy, but they are part of history, and history is rarely tidy. That's why in this episode I keep using words like may, often, usually, and sometimes. Because Ireland's surnames are not necessarily always clean museum labels, if you like. They're living remains of contact, translation, conquest, settlement, migration, bureaucracy, memory, and sometimes even chance. One spelling can hide several histories. One name can be several different rivers meeting under the same bridge. So if we think about that, we can move to another set of names that sound completely Irish now, but often carry a memory of another neighbour across the sea. Cymru, Wales. Wales is one of the quieter presences in Irish surnames. It's not absent, of course, but it's just a little bit quieter. Because when we talk about Ireland and outside influence, we jump to the big dramatic arrivals, the Vikings, the Normans, English conquest, plantation, and Wales is there too. Across the water, close enough to be a neighbour and close enough for movement. And one of the clearest surnames of all that remembers that connection is Walsh. Walsh is now one of those names, as mentioned earlier in examples, that sounds completely Irish. It belongs to the Irish map, it belongs in Irish sport, politics, literature, you name it. But the name itself points towards Wales, because the Irish, the Gaeilge for Walsh, is Brathnach. Brathnach literally means the Welshman or the Briton. So here again, the Irish language is doing the interesting, revealing part for us. It's taking a label of origin and turning it into a family name. Someone is known as the Welshman on Brathnach, and his descendants carry that name. Over generations, the label becomes local, and eventually Walsh sounds Irish. And that's an amazing journey when you think about it, because it means a name can begin by marking someone as not quite from here, but just generations later is very much part of here, a local surname. And it's one of the recurring patterns in this episode. A person arrives, the community names them, their children stays, the name remains, and the meaning becomes less obvious. What was once a marker of difference becomes part of the ordinary soundscape, if you like, of Ireland. Walsh is perfect for that. Because if you hear of Walsh today, you probably do not think, yeah, that's a Welshman. You think of an Irish surname, a familiar one. Underneath it, a memory of movement across water, yes. A reminder, as I always say, that the Irish Sea was not only a separator, but a corridor, and people crossed it, names crossed it, identities changed as they crossed. Think also, Accordia, of Joyce. There is a name that feels deeply Irish in certain parts of the country, especially in the West. Think of the Joyce country, Nashoiga. Joyce, the name, is strongly associated with parts of Galway and Mayo, Galway agus Mayo, and with Connemara, and with the landscape itself. It feels rooted, almost inseparable from the place. But Joyce, too, is usually understood as a name that came to Ireland through an Anglo-Norman or Welsh-linked route. And then, like so many others, it becomes Gaelicised. In Irish, Joyce becomes Shoiga. And once again, that tells us the story of arrival, settlement, and the name being spoken and reshaped by Irish and entering into the landscape. Eventually, you do not just get a family name, but a region associated with that name, Joyce country. So if Walsh shows us an outsider becoming a local surname, Joyce shows us something even more embedded, a name becoming geographical, a family name becoming part of the map. And this brings us to one of our central ideas, that sometimes people are named from places, and sometimes places are named from people. And sometimes an arriving name becomes so rooted that it actually helps to name a region. So again, this is not a simple story of purity. It's a story of becoming. Walsh becoming Irish, not because its origin disappears, but because history keeps moving. Joyce becoming Irish, not because it began as some pure Gaelic past, but because it entered Irish life, Irish speech, Irish geography, and Irish memory. And this is why surnames are so important and so useful. They don't tell us a simplistic version of identity. They show us that Irishness has always involved contact. So the question is not simply, did something come from the outside? The question is added to by what happened after it arrived. Was it resisted? Was it absorbed? Was it translated? Was it Gaelicized? Was it Anglicized then? Did it become local? Did it become part of the map? With names like Walsh and Joyce, the answer is yes. They came through movement, through contact, through the neighbouring world across the water, but in Ireland they become something else. They become Irish surnames. But it's a useful bridge between earlier sections and where we're going next. Because if you think about Irish surnames and you think about their spread not just across Ireland but across the world, they're found in every corner of the globe. But in the country we're going to look at in the next number of episodes of Corja, Irish surnames are common, and they're common for historical reasons, cultural reasons, and social reasons. So Corja, that's where we leave the names that came ashore, at least for now, because of course history didn't stop where we stopped. But the Norse traces, the Viking names, the names shaped by sea, names like Doyle, MacAuliffe, MacManus, Cotter, MacIver, or MacIver, names that remind us Ireland's coastline is not just a closed door, but a doorway. A place where raiders, traders, settlers, languages, towns and families and names moved in and out. And the point is this: Irish names are not just a story of purity or purity at all. They are also a story of contact, and a name can come from the outside and become part of Ireland. Not forgetting where they came from, but by gathering Irish memory, by being spoken here and lived here and written into records. One word that we mentioned in episode 1, and if you haven't listened to episode 1 already, do go back and listen to that, about the O's and the Macs or the Mocks. The word mock. Mock certainly does not stop at Ireland's edge or Mac. Think MacDonald, MacLeod, Mackenzie, etc., and on it goes. You know where I'm going with this. Those names point us towards Scotland, Alban. And so, Corja, my friends, for the next number of episodes, we're going to look at links and history between Ireland and Scotland. Shared language, shared myths, migration, colonisation, Highland experience and Irish experience, and even modern sectarianism, revolutionary links also. And all the ways that those two places have recognised, misunderstood, and haunted each other across the water. Corja, if you enjoyed this particular episode of Undercover Irish and you'd like to support the overheads of keeping this podcast on the road, please do go to Patreon, search Undercover Irish, and for the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can support this show. It helps with everything that goes into putting this podcast together. Gorav míle maithagad a Corja for listening. And until next time, if I've done my job right, when you hear a surname, listen to what's underneath it. It might be a family history. It might be a sea voyage or a road. It might be survival. and sometimes it might be already pointing across the water. So Corja, until the next time, Fanigi Slán, stay safe, agus berigi bua.